Welcome to the Energy Question with David Blackmon. I'm your host, David Blackmon, and my very special guest today is Dr. Ulric Trotz, a former science advisor to the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. He has written a white paper recently that deals with the intersection of energy development and the environment in Guyana, where a consortium led, of course, by ExxonMobil, along with CNOOC and one other company whose name I'm not going to remember right now, which is terrible, has been developing a major oil resource in the offshore of Guyana. And Dr. Trotz, welcome so much to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the Q&A related to the white paper, talk about your role in developing this and why you thought it was, the time was right and this was an important project to take on.
Well, for the last 2 decades, more or less, I've been very much involved in the Caribbean region, building our capacity to respond to the climate change threats that we are faced with. Over the years, basically, we started to understand the need as the result of when you look at the Paris Agreement, the need for countries basically to phase out the use of fossil fuels. For the Caribbean itself, we contribute minimally to the global greenhouse gas budget. So for us, that was not a priority. Our priority is how to protect ourselves from the existential threats of climate change. But our energy, the architecture of the energy sector in the Caribbean region basically demands that we change to renewables simply because we are one of the most energy intensive regions in the world. As a result, we are uncompetitive in our service industries or manufacturing industries, etc. So apart from climate change considerations, it's imperative that we switch to renewables, we phase out fossil fuels, all in keeping with the demands of the Paris Agreement under the Climate Change Convention.
So in your white paper, as I read it, you propose that the country's, Guyana's new status it's going to become really one of the 10 or 12 biggest oil producing countries in the world in the next half decade, given the way the Stabroek project is advancing. Your white paper poses, I think, the proposition that this newfound status and the wealth that's going to be derived from the oil and natural gas out there can actually help the country achieve these long-standing goals of moving to renewables and reaching a net zero carbon status in the decades to come. Do I have that right?
Yes, absolutely correct.
So I know that one thing the country is working on has to do with the natural gas, the associated natural gas production. Just as an example here, in cooperation with the consortium led by Exxon, they're embarked on a project to convert a major coal-fired power plant that's been a big provider of electricity on the island to use that natural gas in order to reduce carbon emissions. Is the plan eventually, in your view, to then convert in later years the natural gas plant to replace it with renewables?
A couple of clarifications there, David. Guyana is in the Caribbean, but it's not an island. It's
right. Yes.
it's on the northern shores of South America.
Right.
The other thing is that we don't. Our energy now is not produced from coal. We're never coal producer. We use heavy fuel oil.
Oh, that's right.
Diesel.
It's fuel oil. Right.
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, there is, there is a conversion in anticipation of moving to renewables. Part of the conversion includes changing the HFO facility that we have to states where they can use either HFO or natural gas. And that is temporary. The focus is that natural gas, which globally has been accepted as one of the most feasible options for countries during the transition. We are going to use that. But at the same time, investing heavily in our hydro potential and also solar and wind energy and also biomass using renewables. So the natural gas is temporary. It will be phased out as we phase in the renewables over a period of time. That's the general sort of idea about Guyana's transition.
My wife and I, it's interesting to us. We like to take cruises on these big ships in the Caribbean, and we visited the islands of, most of the islands in the Caribbean by now. And it's always fascinating to me that it appears to me anyway that fuel oil has really been kind of the power generation fuel of choice in that region for many years now, right? I mean, that's been kind of the prevailing method for decades, since I guess the big oil discoveries in the Caribbean area were offshore Trinidad and Tobago decades ago. Is that right?
Yes, Trinidad and Tobago, and to the south, of course, there is Venezuela.
Right. Yes, of course. Yes. So it's interesting to me. Another point in your paper, you talk about the low carbon status of the production of oil from Staybrook and how that's going to make, as the transition continues over the next several decades, it's going to mean that Guyana's oil production is going to become more sustainable from an emission standpoint, I guess, or than oil produced in other parts of the world. So I guess the expectation is Guyana's oil production may be among the last oil production that is ultimately phased out.
Well, that's, I think, the hope. It's first, the deposit itself is what is referred to as sweet oil, which means that it's really clean. And the method of getting it to the market using these recently developed what they call FPSOs, where floating, the production is on site, the storage is on site, and the offloading to get it to the market is right on site. So that the carbon emissions basically that normally would accrue from transportation, etc., are significantly lower than what is traditionally being experienced. So we, apart from that, it's coming in, well, Rystad Energy says at about $28 per barrel in the production. So it's going to be competitive. And
very low cost.
What has happened is that there's a realization that as all countries transition to net zero, there will be a market for fossil fuels. And I think that is the rationalization basically for production. And as you can see in Guyana, they're ramping up production because that horizon when fossil fuels will be required is not far off. We're talking about net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
And so there is a limited time span when that market will be available.
So one of the reasons, I guess, the revenue stream from this oil is shaping up to become so important for Guyana and its climate goals is the fact that, as you mentioned in your paper, there was a proposed $100 billion capitalization of the Green Climate Fund by 2020 that was made over a decade ago that never really came about. And that has, I guess, served to deny funds to developing nations to engage in these kinds of transition efforts. Talk about that and the reasons why it was first proposed and the reasons why it never really came to fruition.
Well, under the climate change negotiations, global negotiations, we in developing countries have always argued that the reason why we have a problem now with climate is basically as a result of the pattern of development globally since the Industrial Revolution, which is fossil fuel based. Our inputs into the global greenhouse gas budget are minimal compared to the developed countries. And one of the arguments that we've had under the umbrella of the convention is basically saying, well, look, although we weren't responsible due to our geographical setting of poverty and a whole set of other factors, we are exceedingly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, of this issue. And we try to make the case that as poor developing countries, we need some sort of consideration from the developed countries who really have been, you can say, you can point to figures, it's your pattern of development that has put us in this boat, to provide the resources so that apart from the energy issue about going to net zero, we have to build resilience. We have to build resilience in our water systems, our health systems, our coastal infrastructure, etc., to the existential threats that we are already experiencing from climate change. That has been a difficult battle over the years. The Green Climate Fund was supposed to be capitalized at the level of $100 billion US per year. But that recently, as you're seeing figures where they're saying that to address this issue, we need about globally about $4 trillion US per year to address climate resilience issues. We don't have those resources. This has been one of the problems that we have faced. It is not that we don't know what steps we have to take to build a resilience. It's just that we don't have the resources. Amsterdam, for instance, the Dutch coast is basically below sea level, like the coast in Guyana, which is my country, incidentally. But Amsterdam, they have the financial resources to put in place a flood risk system, basically for a 1 in 1,000 year flood event. We in Guyana, we don't have the resources to deal with yearly flooding events and to deal with the impacts. So you see, at the basis of this is access to the financial resources to allow us to move to net zero and to build climate resilience. And just one very quick point about this. Moving to net zero is really would have been the easier way for us, simply because the investments in transforming from fossil fuel to renewable, that's an investment. The internal rate of return on investments in that type of transformation, they are very, very favorable. So you can get an investment in that transformation. However, if I am going to look at my sea defense, etc., that is a public good. And basically, it falls on the shoulders of poor countries to find the resources for that type of protection.
So I am a voracious viewer and sometimes even follow it online. These COP conferences and the WEF conference in January. And along these same lines, it often seems to me that these global gatherings seem to devolve into leaders in the Western world seeming to lecture leaders in developing nations about what they should be doing to address climate change without also recognizing the need for these resources. Do you feel like the way these global conferences, the debates are conducted, has an impact in terms of creating resentment among leaders in the developing world about how all of this is being conducted?
Well, I wouldn't say resentment. They're a bit touchy, those conferences. But the issue, the real issue is that it's not about the developed countries telling us what to do. It's about we telling the developed countries what they ought to do. And the developed countries basically telling us why they can't do it. And this is the issue. I think we are all agreed. I think we are all agreed in the science that we need to phase out fossil fuels, but we also need to draw attention to our vulnerability to a world where climate is changing and it's going to even get worse. So we are talking about protection so that we could survive the worst impacts of climate change. And this is why, resources basically has been the big stumbling block in these negotiations.
Yeah, and to that topic, we saw particularly at the WEF conference in January, response from Europe to the big raft of new incentives and subsidies that the United States put into effect in the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and the concern in Europe that is going to cause investments that may have gone to Europe to suddenly flood into the United States to take advantage of these incentives. I wonder if there is a similar dynamic happening in Guyana and that region of the world as well? Is there great concern among the governments in that part of the world that those incentives in the United States could serve to diminish what otherwise would be investments taking place in the region?
Well, not in the region. I could understand the tension between Europe and the USA because they have the climate for investments, etc. Our issue is looking at the flow of investments into the Caribbean, and this is why the Guyana situation offers us in Guyana, and certainly with some political decisions, a possibility for the wider Caribbean. In that now, with the resources that accrue to the oil and gas discoveries in Guyana, we have an opportunity to utilize those resources to build the sort of climate resilience that we've been looking for, and also to change our energy system from one based on fossil fuels to one in renewables, and also to adopt the appropriate energy efficiency measures.
So one of the advertised benefits, of course, that proponents of all development offshore Guyana have talked about is the potential for job creation among the population in the country. I wonder if you are seeing those benefits start to accrue there among the population there, just in terms of the creation of jobs that everyone has been expecting to happen.
It has a potential. There are a couple of bottlenecks. The first bottleneck basically is that Guyana is a country, it's 83,000 square miles.
Mm-hmm.
Its population, however, is about 750,000. So immediately there is a capacity issue. The opportunities are there, but in terms of the human capacity, the technical capacity to fill some of the jobs, the opportunities that present themselves. So it is necessary for Guyana basically ad interim to invest very heavily on building up that local technical capacity so that more of their population can be involved in the whole oil and gas scenario. The other issue, of course, is one of governance. At the moment, there's some tension between the opposition and the government, and there are, if you look at the press, there are concerns about the availability of opportunities to everyone in
Sure.
Guyana, regardless of race, regardless of their political sort of affiliations. So we have several. The other issue is that we are new boys on the block where oil and gas is concerned. And overnight, we are being pitchforked into the limelight as a future major producer of oil and gas. Or the Petroleum Act that basically directs how business is done. We have a Petroleum Act that was promulgated in 1986, and it is going to be revised. And there should be a new Petroleum Act in place in a very short while. The capacity basically of our institutions, the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, to oversee this new technical area, that has to be built up over time.
Right. Yeah.
One would only hope that the Exxon and the companies that are operating basically would not see this as a loophole for basically taking shortcuts, but that they would, in good corporate practice, ensure that they utilize what we might call international best practice in terms of how they operate in Guyana as we build up our capacity to have proper oversight of the industry.
And we of course, in the region, we see a similar dynamic happening. It's a couple of years behind the development of Guyana's resource, but in Suriname, next door to the east, we have all these a similar set of dynamics taking place in that country as well, correct?
Yes, it is. And I have written on the potential of that in the paper in this sense. All of the countries in the Caribbean, CARICOM, we are committed to net zero growth, net zero and climate resilient growth. Over the years, faithfully under the convention, we've been preparing reports. We've been preparing national climate change adaptation plans. And for the Paris Convention, in keeping with the Paris Convention, we, like other countries, have also put in what we call our nationally determined contributions, which talks about how we're going to phase out fossil fuels which talks about how we're going to build climate resilience.
Right.
But as far as I'm concerned, these are just expressions of intent. What is really required is that we transform all of those documents into portfolios of investment projects, particularly for the energy sector, and basically get about getting the resources to implement them. The resources that are being generated, well, let me backtrack a minute. At the heads of government meeting last year, Caribbean governments put two items on their agenda as priorities: energy and food security. And the paper argues that with the oil and gas resources now in the Guyana, Suriname basin, not to mention the infrastructure, a lot of it on the mothballs at this point in time in Trinidad and Tobago, we have the opportunity to internalize what I call the supply chain for both energy security and food security in the Caribbean, in that the oil and gas that we generate is used to satisfy the entire Caribbean market during the transition. And the natural gas with the chemical complex in Trinidad and Tobago could be utilized to provide us with one of the essential inputs into our thrust to food security, which is the fertilizer. So there is an opportunity basically for us to internalize that whole supply chain for the Caribbean.
That's amazing.
Yes, and I would hope that it would find some sort of traction with the political directorate in the Caribbean. It's an opportunity. You know, they have argued. There has been the argument, and I'm jumping the gun here maybe, that when Guyana was about to move ahead with the production, that we should keep the oil and gas in the ground.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, I must say that I was in that frame of mind at one time, particularly looking at the climate change problematic. In this sense, but the thing is, if you look at our forests, Guyana basically has monetized ecosystem services, and we are part of this global REDD+, reducing emissions from forest degradation and destruction. And they have already entered into an agreement to sell carbon credits arising from the sequestration by our standing forests. We keep the forests, we don't destroy them, we get a compensation for foregoing the revenue that we would derive from our timber, etc.
Right.
Similarly, there was no such arrangement on the ground to tell countries, if you keep your oil and gas in the ground, this is the compensation so that you can forego that development. That's not there. And as you see, even the countries that are in production, I mean, USA recently, they're going to lift the ban on drilling in Alaska. The British government, basically in face of the energy issue after the Ukraine war, they have issued a license for a new coal mine. Similarly, with Germany, they're returning to their coal mines. And even with India, although they are moving towards, the the net zero with renewable energy very aggressively. They're at the same time investing in a $900 million gas distribution pipeline, accepting the principle that natural gas will be a part of their energy security as they move to net zero. So as I said, I was in that frame of mind when I was looking at it purely through climate change lens. But then this question of resources, I see this as an opportunity, basically, for us to more or less live up to the tenets of the Paris Agreement, while at the same time addressing our own vulnerabilities.
Well, that is a wonderful way to wrap this discussion up. We are just right at our 30-minute time limit. And that was going to be my next question, the keep it in the ground thing. So I appreciate you answering in advance. That's really good. You anticipated me. But I really thank you for doing the show with me today. This has been a really interesting discussion. And just for our audience to know, where can they find your white paper? Where can they go to find it online?
You have me there. I have it right.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'll look it up and I'll include it in the show notes when we publish.
Yes. Check Oil Now.
Okay.
Yes, they have it. They have it online.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much
thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to share these views and to make them a bit more public than they are.
Yeah, no, and I'm happy to do it. And it's really an interesting discussion for me. So I really appreciate it. You have a wonderful week.
You too, David. Thank you.
And as we're closing the show, I want to apologize to all my friends at Hess Corporation, which is, of course, the third member of the Staybrook Consortium. I apologize for my senior moment there and not remembering the name of the company. Thank you to the Sandstone Group for hosting our show and to our extraordinary producer, Eric Perel. I'm David Blackmon, and that's all for now.